How's it rockin', Dween Nation? This is the Dween Sports Podcast. We're about to get underway. But before we do, we'd love if you could like, comment, subscribe, or share. We are posting weekly sports content, and we want to build up the brand that is Dween Sports. Thank you all, and enjoy.
Welcome in, Dween Nation. This is your host, Justin Pies, alongside Genoa Agudelo. And today is a special day. It's our first time ever. We're going to start this tradition, Fantasy Awards for the 2024 NFL Fantasy Football season. We got Fantasy MVP, Fantasy LVP. We got our favorite for 2025 next season. We got that Old Man Still Got It award. We got Waiver Wire Hero, Rookie of the Year, the Never Again award, and the Fantasy Playoffs MVP. So that's 8 awards that we're going to discuss. Each of us got picks for that. If you had these players, all right, some of them you were really happy because a lot of these are good awards. There's a couple bad ones. But we're so excited to dive into all of that. Before we do, how you doing, Genoa?
Yo, Dween Nation, how's it going out there? Justin, I feel like we should be wearing tux. I
Yeah,
feel like this should be
right?
a extravagant, event and where we give out these awards. That's okay. It's our first one. I think next year we should have a whole get together and like reveal, you know what I'm saying? Like,
I
how the
love
award
that.
shows
Yeah,
go.
for
But
sure.
I'm doing good, Justin. It was a great fantasy year. And how exciting it was. And honestly, I think next year we have a good idea, better than we did going into this past season on who's going to be the first, I would say 6 to 8 picks. You know what I'm saying? I think
Yeah.
this past year it was a little questionable. Do we draft Tyreek? Laporta was getting thrown in the second round, and people were like iffy on it. I think this year going into next year, it's going to be very obvious the first 5 to 6 picks, as well as kind of how you end it going back into the second. If you guys are picking 9th, 10th, or even in like 12-man leagues, you're picking 11 or 12. But Justin, I'm excited to give out awards because these guys are very deserving of all of them.
Yeah, and you mentioned this to trigger my memory. Dween Nation, I know it might seem like, oh, this is near the end of the NFL season. What are you guys going to come back? Are you guys going to be here? We will be here every week, multiple episodes every week because we love to talk about NFL, college football, basketball, all of those things. Like as you mentioned, the draft's all around the corner, free agency. We'll have early rankings, early predictions, early discussions about just about everything. So we will be here. There's no worries there. We just could try to continue to grow this podcast. But yeah, so we're excited. We will be here all the time. But let's dive into these fantasy awards. For fantasy MVP of this entire season, I went with Jamar Chase. I mean, he was hands down. I mean, he was so good this season. He had those major output games where he had multiple 40-point games. I think he had 2 to 3 40-plus point games. I know the first 2 weeks he had actually under 10, but then from there he skyrocketed, and he those performances are week winning performances. His fantasy playoffs wasn't like crazy and impactful. He wasn't putting up 30, 40, but he was in that 15 to 20 range. But he was just so good this year, playing for that next contract. He's Joe Burrow's main guy, and I mean, if you had him, you were definitely in the top 4, unless the rest of your team was injured or something, because he was just so good, and he would win you games by himself.
Yeah, Justin, what a year Jamar Chase had. Literally unbelievable. He was rather getting 100 yards or a touchdown or both. The targets are there. The fact that he's played with Joe Burrow in college really showed the chemistry that the two have. They're literally the best duo in the league, Justin. They're literally number one in my book, just because of the camaraderie they have, the way they were able to win a national championship in college, the way they were able to make a Super Bowl just a few years later. And so, they're definitely the best league. And so Chase definitely gets my pick for number one pick overall. Not to mention, these LSU wide receivers are absolutely electric. They are fantasy gold. I'm drafting every LSU wide receiver I can next year. That is my number one strategy. Jamar Chase, a stud. For me, I'm going to go with Jahmyr Gibbs. And man, Justin, let me tell you something. I really hope you don't take this guy from me next year's drafts, because you did take Devontae Smith away from me this year.
He
And that
did.
really hurt my feelings. But Justin, this guy, Jamar Chase, literally a league winner. These are the fantasy playoffs, okay? Home at Buffalo, 28 points. At Chicago, 25 points. And then last week, championship week, 26 points. Not to mention that touchdown he had late in the fourth quarter. No way he wasn't winning people fantasy championship across the world, money across the world. This guy is absolutely electric. This is a guy they drafted in the first round a few years ago. They let him kind of, they eased him in a little bit here and there with Montgomery. Montgomery gets hurt. Even with Montgomery hurt this year, Justin, this guy did not score under 10 fantasy points all season long. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. The only week he didn't score 10 fantasy points, Justin, his bye week. And you know what? He's probably going to score 10 or more fantasy points tomorrow night in that game against the Vikings. So this guy's going to carry it all the way. And Justin, if the Lions were to win the Super Bowl, this is the guy that's going to have a great game. He's potential Super Bowl MVP there if they were to make it. Jahmyr Gibbs, literally nothing. He's spectacular. Number one. I honestly wouldn't even look at you if you picked him number one next year.
Yeah, man. It's crazy to think that he is still a top 5, top 7 guy with Montgomery in, but without Montgomery, he is the RB1 hands down. Even over Saquon, even over all these top guys. I think by himself, he is lights out. And as you mentioned, we saw it this fantasy playoffs when Montgomery went down. Everything just went to Gibbs, and he's electric, man. He's so efficient too, and he's quick, and I love that there. Obviously, Saquon, you could argue, could vie in this fantasy MVP list, but the way Gibbs finished the season and the way he's consistent, I mean, you had great performances week in and week out. I could totally see it. So yeah, that's a good pick there. Fantasy LVP though, so we're gonna totally flip to the sad side of it. I put Travis Etienne in this list. I mean, he was at a 3rd round pick, sometimes a late second, and he totally busted this year. He lost his starting job. He didn't have any boom games on the entire season. I mean, it was hard to watch for him. And now he doesn't, Tank Bigsby took over. I mean, he didn't have a game over 13 and a half points. So he was somebody that you could not use. You probably dropped. And he's not a starter anymore. Jacksonville's a crapshoot of bad play, except Brian Thomas Jr. But yeah, no, it was an awful season for him. He's somebody I will not pick up next year. He might not even be on the team. We will see. But he played awfully, and he's not even the starter anymore.
Yeah, Justin. I honestly, I really don't know where Travis Etienne will be playing football, if he will be even playing football in 2025. That's a big possibility. Absolutely disappointing. I remember in our elite league this year, Justin, I was able to pick him in the 3rd round. I felt good about it because I already had Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor. And I was like, man, I'm going to have 3 great running backs. His ETN was pretty decent in 2023. But no, he was absolutely disappointing. Didn't even have 100 yards at all this year. Did he even score 2-3 touchdowns? There were some games where Tank Bigsby just took over. And then the Jaguars, outside of Brian Thomas Jr., were just stagnant. And Trevor Lawrence wasn't really the guy that we expected him to be. He hasn't really looked like the number 1 pick. And so I think that kind of affects Etienne. Not to mention, Etienne doesn't really get carries, that like the majority of the work share. So definitely the fantasy LVP. For mine, Justin, I know we talked a little bit off air about when I was thinking of mine. I'm going to actually change mine on spot right here. And there's 2. One of them is Deebo Samuel. He's like my little bit of a honorable mention because he had 2 good games to start the season, and then he had another one in week 6, and then he had a great game week 16. But by then, a lot of people who've had Deebo, probably out of the playoffs. But from week 7 to week 15, just absolutely boring, awful, in an offense that needed him, that struggled with McCaffrey being out. Why couldn't you be Deebo 2021? So that's one of them, Deebo Samuel. Another one is Breece Hall. This was a guy that was picked top 5 this year. I remember when we were looking at mock drafts, Breece Hall was literally top 5. Like, people were saying, oh, we'll pick him over Bijan or pick him over Jahmyr Gibbs or, even like Puka, which is crazy. He had some good games this year. I wouldn't say he's an LVP because he did have some great games, but the work share wasn't what we expected. So I wouldn't say it's all the way LVP. But the last one, I'm going to go with DK Metcalf. He is, for me, an LVP. Just because he was the de facto number 1 wide receiver there. I was hoping for a bigger leap. And I just feel like, yeah, you have Geno at quarterback, but you still have a pretty good offense around. That not defenses are looking at you that much. So I'm very disappointed in DK Metcalf this year. Didn't really finish strong. Hasn't really scored a touchdown in a while. Only had one or two 100-yard games. Not only that, he's no longer the number one receiver on his team. It's now Jackson Smith and Jigba.
Yeah, looking at those three guys, obviously they all could fit in this category for me. Brees Hall, the fact that he was a top 5 pick and he is under the top 16 or 17 running back, so he's not even top 15 at the running back position. He did have 4 big games, but I don't think it's a damage to how good he is as a player. They started using other backs for some reason. The team was bad, and there's all that drama around them. So I think that kind of clouded his season and made his season not great. He did have those few good games, but I think he definitely fits in this category. Deebo Samuel had a couple of good games, as you mentioned, here and there. One of his biggest games was when probably nobody started him in the playoffs. But yeah, he just doesn't look the same. You thought with Brandon Ayuk being out for the season that Deebo would step in and become a top guy like he was a few years ago. That was not the case. I think it's very clear he's gone from this team next year. So he'll land on another team somewhere and not be super effective. So he probably fits to me in that never again tier award that we'll talk about later. So I see that there. And then with DK only had more than 4 catches in a game 3 times this year, and he played every game. So he was not targeted that often. I know JSN stepped into that role and became the lead guy. I don't think it changes back to DK at all. JSN, it looked really great this year. He deserves that spot. I think what's interesting next year that will leave people either less enjoyed about DK or more is that there'll probably be a new quarterback at the helm for the Seahawks, being a rookie or whatnot. So I'm interested to see how that turns, but definitely all 3 fit that bill pretty good for LVP. Moving on to 2025 favorite, I got Nico Collins. He, through the first half of the year, was the number 1 wide receiver. He was great. Then he had the injury, was out for 4 weeks, came back. And the reason I'm so excited, though, for next year is CJ played very poorly this year. This was not his season. He knows that. The Texans know that. Fans know that. And Nico was still a top guy, one of the top 5 guys. He's still balling out every single week. He was the safety valve. He was the guy that you could score deep. You could go in intermediate routes. And so next year, I expect CJ to get back on the horse, have a much better season. And in doing so, Nico is going to thrive.
Absolutely, Justin. Nico Collins is probably going to be getting picked around the 7th to 9th pick towards the end of the first. Maybe some people will probably over draft him maybe at the 5th or 6th spot, but I like him going into leaving the first, going into the second. But yeah, he's going to be a top receiver for years to come for us here in Houston. That's CJ's guy. And they're gonna be looking for some other wide receivers since the unfortunate injury of Tank Dell. But I think no matter what, Nico's the number 1 guy there, clear cut. He's now being labeled as a top 5, top 6 receiver in all of pro football, which is good to hear. Heartwarming as a Texans fan. For me, my favorite going into next year is Josh Jacobs. I really liked what I saw out of this Green Bay offense as far as giving carries to Josh Jacobs. I know maybe a lot of Jordan Love managers didn't really like it too much because I was one of them. But maybe even if you believed in Christian Watson, or maybe you a big Dobbs believer, you had some good games here and there, but it wasn't consistent. But Josh Jacobs was the only consistent thing about the Green Bay Packers when it comes to fantasy football. There, even Tucker Kraft kind of fell off the graces of fantasy football. He had a couple hot weeks there. But I like Josh Jacobs going into next year because I think he's going to get all the carries, all the touches. There really isn't any running back there that concerns me. No Emmanuel Wilson, or even the other guy that they drafted. I'm forgetting his name there. But I just don't think there's anybody that can kind of hold a candle there to Josh Jacobs in Green Bay. Not to mention that the Packers really aren't into drafting big names. So that's something that, they're always going to draft defense or offensive line or someone just random. And Jacobs, he had a great year this year, and he was getting, goal line touches. And I think that it doesn't end there. Historically, Green Bay, since LaFleur's got there, they've been able to rely on one running back. Obviously, there was the A.J. Dillon game, so that's because Aaron Jones was hurt. So I think that if, Josh Jacobs is healthy, he's going to have another solid year. He's not that up there in age, and he's still getting paid a big contract. So I have, all the faith in Josh Jacobs. As long as he's healthy, he'll be one of my favorites going into next year.
Yeah, I mean, he's still only 26 years old too, so I feel like some people might look at him and they're like, isn't he in that Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry tier where he's getting older? No, he's still 26. He'll be 27 by the season start. And he's on such a great team. He's scoring a bunch of touchdowns. I think he's going to be great. I think to me, he doesn't have the RB number one, like Saquon-esque kind of year in him. I think that like RB 4 to 8 range is like where he is, but that's still a great play. If you can get him mid to late second. I think it's where
he's the best. Yeah, he's the best RB2. Like,
oh yeah, I get you. Yeah, for sure. And I'd still be happy with having him as my RB1 next year. But yeah, so I like that pick there for Josh Jacobs. Moving to the next, old man still got it award. I got Joe Mixon. Now, obviously, you could argue Derrick Henry was also on this short list, but I knew Derrick Henry was going to ball out with the Ravens. I wasn't worried about his age as much. I thought, hey, he's still going to be a top 10 guy for sure. It was Mixon where, well, last year we saw Pierce and Singletary in Houston. And we were like, this wasn't too exciting. And Mixon has gotten less efficient every year of his career, literally from his rookie year to now. And so I was literally like, I don't think this is going to work out with Mixon in Houston. He's getting older too, and older back. He's hit his peak. But he was great this year. I know that season didn't end in the way that fantasy managers wanted it to, but that's more of the Texans' fault. Mixon, though, he was a 20-point gimme every week for a long time, and he was the guy that they relied on. Obviously, they had a bunch of injuries to the wide receiver room, and maybe that's why. But I think that he is here to stay, and he's here to have a season like this one next season, and I expect the Texans to be a better team next season, too.
Yeah, Justin, I like Joe Mixon going into next year. I think he's going to possibly be the back-to-back winner for you going into next year. I miss those days of week 1 where we went into Indianapolis and everybody ate. Diggs scored a touchdown and Mixon had over 100 yards and Nico was making plays. Those are some good times. But I like Joe Mixon. He's a workhorse there. I think that injury, the first couple weeks of the season, I kind of threw him off, but he was still able to show flashes. And you mentioned the Texans struggling. That's the reason why he's kind of been, not there. But I do think that if we get that offensive line together, he'll be good going into next year. For me, I'm gonna go with. I gotta go with old man Mike Evans. Our guy, our Texas A&M guy there, and Mike Evans. He had a big injury, kind of missed a big chunk in the middle of the season. Had he not been injured there, Justin, he possibly would have definitely had a better year fantasy wise, especially the way Baker Mayfield was playing. And Justin, he came right back in time into your starting lineups to win you guys' fantasy championships. Had some great games in the fantasy playoffs from Mike Evans there, the future Hall of Famer.
Yeah, man. I mean, I was expecting a good year. I obviously went over the offseason. We were talking about how this team doesn't have Dave Canales anymore, and this offense might, drop back down. But it didn't. And Evans, even at his age, he's still balling out. I think he's trying to get his 1,000 yards this year. He's very close. So he's going to be playing this week. And hopefully, he's just great. And I think he's going to be great next year, too. I think he's still got it in the tank for at least next year. I think after next season, maybe we can have the conversation that things are going to start dwindling down for him. But he's full force next year, and he's still got it for sure. Like, this is Mike Evans' award almost. I really agree with that one. Moving to the next one, we got Waiver Wire Hero, the guy that you were able to scoop off the waiver wire. You were a good fantasy manager, and you utilized what was given to you in the waiver wire, and now you have a player that helped you win a championship, and that's Bucky Irving for me. Even with sharing snaps with Rachaad White, he was just phenomenal, super efficient. He could catch out the backfield. Not somebody I was crazy high about going into the draft next year, candidly. I thought he's too small. He wasn't like uber fast. But hey, from weeks 10 and on, he had 16-plus points besides the game he left injured. So he really took over that backfield. And I think next year it's going to be his backfield because Rachaad White, yeah, he had a good year last year, but there was always something wrong with him. He wasn't very efficient. He had fumbling issues, and that was kind of exposed this year. And I think the Buccaneers are really happy they found a guy that they can rely on in Bucky Irving. And if you were able to scoop him up in the early weeks of the season, Probably it was a week 4 or 5. He kind of started becoming a relevant name. If you were able to scoop him up and play him, you had an RB1 all season, most of the season. So I think that he is for sure, he fits this bill as waiver wire hero.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. I remember him getting drafted where he got drafted. And I was thinking, I don't know if he gets into Rashad White's touches just because of how good Rashad White did last year. But I agree with you. He's definitely gets that title of the waiver wire, pickup of the year, waiver wire hero. For me, I'm gonna go with the third straight Buccaneer in our awards, and I'm gonna go with Baker Mayfield as my waiver wire pickup of the year. Had a fantastic playoffs there. Was able to take advantage of the matchups he had, and give me Baker Mayfield. This is a guy that I like to bash often. I like to make fun of and pick at and say he sucks. But this year he proved me wrong, and he actually had a good year. And he was, I'll admit, one of the best waiver wire pickups. If you were able to draft a team that was loaded with running backs and wide receivers, and you didn't really, have a quarterback, and you were able to get this guy and set him in your lineup, you most definitely won a championship.
Yeah, he was great, and I agree. I wasn't always the biggest fan of Baker, especially in his Cleveland days. To me, he got on my nerves.
Yeah.
It just was he was never that guy to pull off good performances. He to me damaged players around him. Then he bounced to Carolina, same thing, and then at the Rams he had that brief spark with a couple games, and then goes to Tampa Bay. Not a lot of hope, but he has been so good this year. He had a better year than last year. And again, we were talking about Dave Canales in the offseason. He leaves to Carolina. We're like, these things are doomed. These guys are doomed. But Liam Cohen comes in. He's a great coordinator. And Baker Mayfield's playing by far the best football of his career. You got Evans, you got Irving, you got Godwin coming back next year. Cade Otton broke out this year. So he's not only a waiver wire hero this year, he's going to be a guy you can draft next year. So I agree. I think he totally fits that bill. Moving to Rookie of the Year, the rookie that was sensational, stepped in, and was phenomenal. And we both have the same guy here, and that is Brian Thomas Jr. All you can say, he's on a bad team. Things weren't looking great. I'm like, okay, they're probably going to fire Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence. Oh, he gets hurt during the year. Who cares? This guy is phenomenal, top 10 wide receiver on the season. And he was that from the onset. He was great. These LSU wide receivers, as we talked about, are just so good. And yes, there's a dud here and there. You got Kayshon Boutte and Terrace Marshall. But when you get those first round guys like Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase, Jay Jettas, you got to pick them up. And Brian Thomas showed us all that. And I'm curious, give me your take on Brian Thomas, but also where are you drafting him next year?
Yeah, Justin, I'm drafting Brian Thomas easily in the second round. Second or third, I would say. Would I draft him over Nico Collins? I don't know. Am I drafting him over Puka? I don't know. Maybe Puka goes first round. I would say that I got to get my running back. I think people are going to draft him in the second, but if you can get him in the third round, Justin, if you can get Brian Thomas in the third round, wow, literally. Like, I want to see your team.
BTJ or AJ Brown? It's a tough one.
That's tough. I'm gonna stick with AJ Brown just because he's more proven and he has. I think he still has some more years ahead of him with Jalen Hurts in that offense. But that's still very close there. It's very, very close. But I definitely picked Brian Thomas to match you on our only kind of same award that we kind of agree on there. Brian Thomas was absolutely phenomenal as far as Rookie of the Year. I really wish it was Neighbors. I'm more of a Neighbors fan, but I'm not gonna lie. This guy Brian Thomas Jr. I'm a Texans fan, so him being in our division's a little scary. But this is a guy that you definitely can draft in the second or third round. Feel confident because Justin, he proved it with Trevor Lawrence and he proved it with Mac Jones. So we think Mac Jones will probably stay the backup. Who knows? Maybe he'll get an offer to go to like Las Vegas or something. But I really like Brian Thomas going into next year in fantasy playoffs. Justin, this was his stats. Week 15 against the Jets, 32 fantasy points. Week 16, semifinals week, 28 points. And then the championship, 23 fantasy points. Didn't even get hit 100 there. So if you would have got 100, you would have had some more points there. Right. But definitely a guy that he is honestly at all our awards. I think he's like more of the unanimous pick for this topic.
Yeah,
for
for
for,
sure.
for rookie of the year. As far as fantasy, not like in real, that's going to go to Jane Daniels, but I would say fantasy wise for sure, more of the rookie of the year than Daniels.
And especially where you drafted him. Neighbors a top, 5-round pick. Obviously Marvin, Jaden Daniel was still in that like 7, 8, 9 round. So he was also a huge pickup, like a steal of a pickup. So yeah, I think we're unanimous on that. Moving to the Never Again award, guys that they were unbearable to start. They were just guys that going into the next year I cannot draft. And Genoa and I, my pick is one that I had him in my two biggest leagues. I thought, hey, this is the year you draft a top 5 wide receiver, a guy who's been a college phenomenal star for a couple of years now. You got a star tight end. You have a great running back, a Pro Bowl caliber running back. And boy, was that one of the most frustrating teams and quarterbacks to watch. I'm talking about Kyler Murray. It was tough. You would think too, with that rushing upside he has, and but he never had those major boom games. He had one boom game in week 2 against the Rams. Other than that, it was ranging between like 8 fantasy points and like 18 fantasy points. Nothing was ever going to win you a week. He had so many head scratching plays, interceptions, and just not making plays. The Arizona Cardinals team, this should be a better team. They have a unit, and maybe it's coaching. I don't think it is. I think it's Kyler, and a lot of people have pointed it out. Maybe it's too short. I don't know if that's a fair criticism, but it could be. But he's a guy going into next year. He's going to have again a great unit of weapons, but I am not picking him up. This is not going to happen for me. I can't go through this again. Obviously, I need some time maybe to grieve it and get over it. But Kyler's on my never again award list.
Justin, I going through this never-ending cycle every single year with Kyler Murray. It's been a recurring thing for 4 years. Where August, I'm feeling great about Kyler Murray. Week 1, I'm feeling great about Kyler Murray. Week 6, I'm feeling okay about Kyler Murray. Week 11, no one's feeling good about Kyler Murray, only but me. And then week 17 to 18, I'm out on Kyler Murray. And then it might be a recurring thing come August. But right now, I'm going to agree with you. I don't think it's himself, the talent. I think that maybe Jonathan Gannon is an okay coach, but maybe not the one for Kyler. I think Kyler in his career, he's kind of had those young head coaches, Cliff Kingsbury. I think he had Lincoln Riley, and so now he has Jonathan Gannon. He hasn't really had that old vet or an old vet coordinator to kind of scold them, mold them the way he should be. I think he's talented. I just think that he lacks a little bit maturity. I have, seen him fall off with teammates. I just what happened with him and Hopkins was just weird to me. How they just sent him to Tennessee, and it's like he starts good every year. Justin, he's good, and then week 11, it's just like what the heck happened? He has the talent. He can run. He can throw. He's got Marvin Harrison. It's like I'm just gonna blame coaching, and it's like I guess Arizona isn't the most stable franchise. They haven't really won anything ever, outside a couple playoff games. So that's why I give it to them. So I guess I can see you. I was waiting for your take. So I agree, Kyler. You had him in a couple leagues, and he let you down, man. Especially with having Marvin. For me, I'm gonna go with KC running backs. Any kind of Chiefs running backs. I'm just now. I look. I know Pacheco was hurt, and I know in the middle of the season, Kareem Hunt had some pretty decent good games. I think he had a great game on a Monday night against Tampa Bay. But still, Justin, these Kansas City running backs and this Kansas City offense in general, I just think going forward into next year, I think that Mahomes is going to have Worthy. He's going to have Rashee Rice, we think, with the ACL and the off the field issues. But if they keep Hopkins, that's another target. They might or might not. Hollywood Brown's going to be back, and they're going to have someone random, even with the draft or free agency, that the Chiefs will pick up and turn into a star. Not to mention that I think is it Jonas Gray, Josh Gray, I think his name is the tight end.
No, Gray.
Oh yes, Gray. He might be the next guy there. They might draft another tight end. Travis Kelce could be back. What my point is that this probably team is going to be headed towards a pass-heavy offense. And Pacheco, is he the same after that injury? Kareem Hunt, is he even going to be on the team next year? Not to mention the Chiefs are going to draft somebody. Come on, it's the Kansas City Chiefs. with Andy Reid. They're going to have someone new, some different utility guy, someone different. My point is, I'm not drafting Kansas City running backs going forward. I don't really think Pacheco is 100% there. He might be used well in the playoffs this year, but in fantasy regular seasons, I want nothing to do with Kansas City running backs. This is a pass-heavy offense. They've had a down year this year, but going into next year, I'm not getting any Chiefs running backs.
I'm kind of on the fence with this one. I can totally see your point. I think when multiple running backs are healthy, if like going into next year, they bring back Hunt, and obviously they have Pacheco, it's going to be tough to me to rely on either one of them. I think they're going to want to utilize both, and that only hurts in fantasy because you won't get the best of one. So I totally see that there. Hunt surprised me. He had numerous amounts of good games, I think, when Pacheco was out. And then last year, Pacheco had a really solid season. So I think that going into next year, it depends on how this running back room is stacked up. But I can see it. Usually, it's not something you can rely on, especially the Clyde Edwards-Helaire era. That was painful to go through. So there's definitely thoughts of back to that time. But Pacheco's good, and I think he might have a contract year next year. So he might be in it for some dinero. So I'm on the fence though. I could totally see your point though. And then moving to the last one, we saved this for last because if you won your championship, you are infatuated and in love with this person right here because you made the playoffs and they got you to winning that title. And this is the Fantasy Playoffs MVP award. And I have Jonathan Taylor. Obviously, first round, he had a solid game. He rushed over 100 yards, but he had that fumble that a lot of people talk about, the mistake where he just dropped it right at the goal line. And he took that to heart. He took that to heart and came out and was the RB1 hands down over the next 2 weeks. He had, over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns in the game in week 16. So if you had him that week, you won your game. He had 218 and 3 touchdowns. Then he backed that up with 125 and 2 touchdowns in the fantasy championship. So he had, 14 plus points in each of these games. Obviously, in my biggest league and in our other league, we both had Taylor. We just miss out on those major performances because I lost in the first round of the playoffs. Then the next week, Taylor goes for 44 and then 31. So those hurt a little bit. But if you were able to win your first matchup, he definitely won you a championship. He was that guy. I think that makes me a little bit more excited for next year. I think he's going to step in and play very well. Again, he can be a guy in that second round for sure, where he kind of was drafted this year in that late first, early second. I'd be happy with that. But yeah, he was definitely the MVP of your playoffs. He had those Jamar Chase like numbers where he was himself was winning you a game. But yeah, he's my MVP.
Yeah, Justin, I absolutely just want to let you guys know out there in Dween Nation that I did pick Jonathan Taylor 4th overall in the first round in our $250 league.
You did.
I feel kind of good about it now the fantasy season's over. But you know what? I feel good about it. Going into next year, I really love Jonathan Taylor. This is the running back that people were ready to count out. But no, I didn't believe it. I picked him in the first round, paired him up with Derrick Henry. And my guy is a guy that I drafted in that league as well, and that is Jared Goff. He is, and to go along with all Lions players, but Jared Goff in the fantasy playoffs, you got in the first week of the playoffs, he had that home game against Buffalo. That was a shootout. 41 fantasy points there in our league, and then the following week he goes to Chicago, and it's like, you know what? I didn't think he'd have a good game, but he went out there, had 330 yards, 3 touchdowns. And then championship week there, if you were down a little bit and you had that Jared Goff, he was winning you title games because he was throwing it to Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think Laporta scored. And it's like everybody on that Lions offense eats. He moves the ball. And so if you had any Lions player throughout the fantasy championship, it was, the playoffs. You had Amon-Ra St. Brown. Obviously, we talked about Jahmyr Gibbs at the top of the episode. Laporta, he was on and off. And Jameson Williams there. And so Jared Goff, literally phenomenal. And he had the offense to do it. He had the games that I called for to throw. And he was phenomenal. So Lions players, but more specifically, I would say Jared Goff is my fantasy league winners.
Yeah, I love that take there. I'd argue that those 3 games were the best 3-game stretch of Jared Goff's career. Like he was not only put up a bunch of points, but he was efficient with it. He didn't have any turnovers in those games. So he was a guy that was just getting you fantasy points for the best team, or you could argue in football, the Lions. And yeah, if you had him, I mean, also you could argue he might have been a waiver wire scoop up to help you win your championship. Obviously, you maybe scooped him up in week 10 or 11 because he was having a good year most of the season. But if you had him in those fantasy playoffs, you were thrilled because you didn't have to spend huge capital on like a Hurts who unfortunately got injured and missed the championship game and missed week 16 mostly essentially. So yeah, Goff I think was a great pick there. But yeah, Dween Nation, those are our fantasy awards, 2024 fantasy awards. I mean, what an episode it was. Super fun to discuss those guys, those names, and how we kind of discussed too how we think next year is going to look for them. We are very excited for a bunch of them, less excited for others. But yeah, that kind of caps off our regular season discussions because next week is the NFL playoffs. But yeah, thank you guys for listening. This is so much fun. We will be here all off season and all playoffs discussing matchups, predictions, everything you would think about. So stay tuned. And Genoa, send us out.
Yo, Dween Nation. This was kind of our last fantasy episode of the year. However, it won't be long from after the draft, after free agency, where we start popping up some mock drafts. But until then, we have a ton of football content to get out there to you guys. The NFL playoffs is around the corner. You know how much we love the Super Bowl as we started it last year, and we went all into depth. We're going to go even more into depth. And then, free agency, the draft, not to mention our NBA content is not too far away. So we have a ton of stuff there leading back into next year's fantasy awards. Hopefully, Justin and I have a couple more championships on our hands, some money to brag about there. But thank you guys for watching. We love you guys. And as always, peace.
Peace.